Today I will be talking about the Google AdWords component, using which you can pull data from your Google AdWords API into a data warehouse. Let's start by looking at the prerequisites to work with the component. You need a Google account with access to the AdWords data, a developer token that's been authorized for production accounts, a customer ID for the account which owns the data, and a client ID and secret for OAuth registration purposes. The first thing you do, if you haven't already done that, is to register for OAuth in Matillion so that we can authenticate against your Google account. Go to the project menu and manage OAuth, and then follow a couple of steps in order to complete the process. The process is documented on our support site. Search for setting up OAuth and you'll come across the necessary documentation. For Google AdWords component, you'll follow the third-party OAuth setup link for further instructions on going through the process. Once you've finished registering for OAuth, add a Google AdWords component to the job panel. Start by setting authentication to the OAuth entry you've registered earlier. Set a developer token and the client ID. And then choose the data source from a drop-down. I'm going to go with Geo Performance and then select a couple of columns that we need from that particular data source. For a list of available data sources and the columns within them, you may refer to the data model section of our documentation. The rest of the properties deal with your target in Snowflake. It starts by specifying an S3 staging area. This is a S3 bucket we'll use to hold your data. And the other property you need to specify is the table name where you'd like Matillion to import this data. Once you specify the minimum required properties, the component changes to green, at which point you can choose to run the component or run the job to test this component. By default, the component will pull data for the last 7 days. Next, we'll look at how we can retrieve data for a custom date range. I've just opened another job, it has the start component in it, and I'll start by copying the AdWords component we've just built. So let's connect those two and bring it in line. We specify a date range by setting a data filter using start date and end date pseudo columns. We call them pseudo columns because they're not part of the data model, but exist purely to help you define a date filter. These are hidden by default, and to enable them, you do need to add an entry or a connection option for pseudo columns, and the value should be asterisk equals asterisk. Go to data source filter, add a new entry, and now you should find your start date, and then add another entry for end date. And I'm going to set that to say 7, so that's about a week's worth of data. Click on OK. And the next time you run this component, it's going to bring back data for that specific date range. Next, we'll look at parameterizing the component using variables. I'd like to parameterize the customer ID, start date, and end date, so I can reuse these with other Google AdWords components I may add to this workflow. So let's start by adding some local job level variables. Start date and end date. I'll just give some defaults for these. I'll use the same default for start date and end date so that they'll always pull for just 1 day if they're not disturbed. And then select the Google AdWords component and use variables where required. For our use case, let's say we'd like to set start date and end date to yesterday's date. Anytime you run the job, it'll always run for the previous day. To do that, add a Python script component to your job. For now, I'm gonna just copy a script that I've already got. Let's just see if the script works as expected. And there you can see it's setting the value that I need. And the next time I run it, or if I'm to schedule this job, every time the job runs, it's going to pull in data for the previous day.